Hi guys, it's Tom from coAdjoint here, and this video is about modelling moral decisions in Unity 3D using coAdjoint Orbit. The topics I'll be covering are my definition of morality modelling, shortcomings of the current morality modelling techniques we've seen in games such as Fable and Bioshock, how coAdjoint Orbit can perform morality modelling without some of the shortcomings of current techniques, along with an explanation of the software, an outline of the techniques we're used with coAdjoint Orbit to perform the modelling, and finally we're going to Unity to implement the model and test it out in a sandbox game environment. But before we can start, I just want to explain a few things I won't be covering in this video. So firstly, this video won't cover any philosophical or theological aspects of morality. The purpose of this video is to explain how to create a morality system for a video game, which may have little realistic meaning. The contents of this video in no way represents my ideas about morality, and the modelling example at the end of this video only serves to demonstrate the power of coAdjoint Orbit. Secondly, I won't be discussing what makes a good or bad person. The measures of good and bad I've used in this video only serve to educate developers and shouldn't be taken as my ideas on morality. Now let's define exactly what I mean by morality modelling. So for the purpose of this video, I've split it into two parts. Firstly, morality modelling encompasses attributing moral values to game events. So for example, if a character in a game kills an innocent man, a morality model will assign context and sometimes enumerable value to that event. So for example, a game may consider innocent killings bad. Secondly, it's the determination of the overall morality of a game character through consideration of the sum of their moral actions. A morality model must consider all game events and decide how to characterise that character based on those events. So if you want some examples of a game with moral systems, I suggest you look at Bioshock 1 and 2 and the Fable games. So the way that morality modelling is done in current games has, in my opinion, a number of shortcomings, which most gamers are well aware of. So firstly, character morality is often determined by a small number of highly important events. In Bioshock, morality was almost entirely determined by your choice to save little sisters or extract their Eve. Decisions outside of these interactions had no impact on your moral evaluation by the game, making the moral system unsatisfying to some gamers. Following on from this point, most morality models box you as good or bad, with not much in between. This is often too simple to be interesting. Next, morality is usually only an important factor for a handful of game events. RPGs are notable exceptions, where reputation can change dialogue with NPCs. However, most games will just use morality to choose your alternative ending, without ever significantly enriching gameplay or game mechanics. And finally, what I believe to be the biggest shortcoming of current systems is the way importance is assigned to moral decisions. How do you decide the importance of each morality-defining event to the overall determination of good or bad? The example I've provided is that if the player makes 4 good moral decisions and 2 bad ones in the course of a game, is he a bad person? Obviously, the answer depends on the importance of those events. But how do you take into consideration the time the decision was made in the game? Can we repent and change from a bad start to a good ending? If so, how do you define the rules? Most games simply just don't bother. The reason for all these shortcomings is not because developers don't want to do this, it's mainly because such systems are often difficult to implement and further take time and money. Now hopefully I'll demonstrate with this video that coAdjoint Orbit can help reduce the problems of 3 out of 4 shortcomings I've just described. The only one we can't help is about the number of game events that moral decisions have impact, which is simply determined by development time constraints. Now before you proceed, we need to understand exactly what coAdjoint Orbit is. Orbit is an artificial intelligence plugin for Unity 3 and Pro. Although it was designed to be used in conjunction with coAdjoint Action, which is a character development software for Unity 3D, it's actually fully functioning as a standalone product. Orbit works by learning what traits or skills say about the way the character is playing the game. This information can be used by the game to react to different character strategies or builds in RPG terms. So the way we use coAdjoint Orbit is to model traits that characterise good or bad morality and then teach Orbit to understand what that says about the character. For example, a character who has high jealousy or selfishness traits would be classified as bad, whereas a character with high kindness and empathy would be classified as good. If this is confusing, make sure you stay watching until we implement the morality model in Unity. It's actually very simple to do. So how exactly does this help? Well, firstly, Orbit allows for non-linear classification of characters' traits profiles. We don't need to invent the rule or formula that determines if a character is good or bad, as Orbit just learns from the way that we're teaching it. Orbit's classification process doesn't care about how many good or bad decisions you've made, it only cares about your trait values. Leading on from this point, scales of morality, i.e. very good, good, bad, very bad for example, are easier to implement as Orbit will just follow by your example. More classifications would previously have meant more difficult rules, many special cases and more bugs. And finally, although it doesn't take away all of the work, by making moral classifications simpler, Orbit enables developers to include many more events throughout the game, as the developers now only have to worry about what classification the character lies on, not how he got there. Besides these points, there are many other benefits to the Orbit modelling system, such as a deeper understanding of the emotional state of a character, but these benefits can only really be utilised in conjunction with coAdjoint action, which I don't really have time to go into in this video. Before moving to Unity, first let's explicitly outline the steps we're going to take in the coAdjoint Orbit editor to implement our morality model. Firstly, we create a network of traits that we consider important for determining the morality of a character. Then we'll choose classifications for a character such as saint, good, neutral, bad and evil. We'll then generate training examples for Orbit to learn how to classify different characters' traits until we're satisfied that Orbit is producing acceptable results. And then finally we create a simple Unity scene to test our model in a sandbox game environment. So without further ado, let's open up Unity. So here we are in Unity, and I've already imported the Orbit editor for Unity. I've also created a library here, which you open up by highlighting the library in the project view, and then you press Edit Library. And I'm now just going to show you how to actually create traits or skills in the Orbit editor. So all I'm going to do now is press Ctrl F, and this will bring up a little window here that will allow me to add a new skill to a network. Now in the video I referred to skills as traits, because for morality modelling it perhaps makes sense to call these things traits instead of skills, but skills is just the language of the Orbit editor. So for our purposes, we don't need to worry about these numbers Q, B and V here, as they're only really important for coAdjoint action or using the action computational engine. So we just need to give it a name, and then we provide the context on the trait or skill in the actual game itself. So I don't know, let's assume we're not actually going to use this skill, that recall how religious you are as a trait that is important for your moral code. This is absolute rubbish, but just go with me for a second. Please don't look too much into that. I don't believe that to be true whatsoever. So anyway, as you can see that we've created this skill now, we can highlight it. Information about the skill appears in the inspector there. We can move it around as we so wish. I'm going to delete the skill now, and I'm going to hold middle mouse, and I'm going to show you the network that we are actually going to use for this this modelling process. So before I explain this ellipse here, I'm just going to go through each of these traits that we're going to be using for our modelling. We've got kindness, empathy, forgiveness, helpfulness, truthfulness and assertiveness, greediness, jealousness, selfishness and aggressiveness. So these 5 skills here would correspond to skills where higher values, or traits where higher values correspond to, probably as in terms of Western morality, a better person. This skill here, assertiveness, is something that I think is not necessarily something on its own that makes much moral sense, but when you combine it with other skills, it starts to give you a context on that person. So for example, if someone is extremely assertive and very aggressive, that could mean that they don't necessarily repress their feelings of aggression. You know, they would confront their aggression, and that could make them a stronger, more evil person perhaps than someone who is perhaps very helpful and assertive. So when they see someone in trouble, they would help them more quickly than perhaps someone who isn't particularly assertive. And these skills over here represent traits which high levels correspond to necessarily probably a bad person. So if someone is greedy or aggressive or very selfish or very jealous, they're likely to not be that necessarily a good person. Now, this ellipse here, which when I double clicked just highlighted all of the skills, is used to group these skills together. It's called an orbit group. And an orbit group is used for the training of coAdjoint Orbit in the Orbit trainer, so that it tells Orbit that we want the levels of these traits to be similar to each other, because it's unlikely that someone is very greedy and so might have a trait level of 100 in greediness but then 0 in jealousy. So we want these levels to be somewhat similar to each other to create realistic training examples. Equally, I could have grouped these skills together here, but I've chosen not to, just to create some variety in the training process. So that's really the gist of creating skills in the network editor, at least for morality modelling. I'm now going to move across to the Orbit trainer and show you how to train coAdjoint Orbit to process information about this network.